Great, thank you. It's wonderful to be here. And it was actually a very good segue there, the discussion about trade just now, because indeed we want to talk a lot more about some of the issues that we confront really in markets when we're thinking about how organizations in the broadest sense actually in the legacy environments deal with data, credentials. Trade is one very, very good and prominent example, but of course there are many other contexts in which we're trying to support that transition of different aspects of the economy, whether it be in domestic settings or internationally, towards a really fully digital economy reflected in some of the remarks actually that Stefan brought up. So we'd like to just really bring together a few highlights of some of the requirements. We don't want to talk about wallets per se or technical environments, but really give a taste of what we'll be talking about tomorrow in certain sessions where we're really exploring some of the practical market-driven use cases and challenges of moving to a digital economy that can generate much more efficiency gains for us overall, while still being inclusive and interconnected across borders. So we'll just highlight a few things around the building blocks, and then Darrell and Vasily will talk a little bit more about some of the key design choices that we need to make and that we're still struggling with to a certain extent, and why this collaborative event here is just so timely and so important, I think. A lot of these components in the ecosystems we're talking about, you've been through today many, many times over, but it's worth kind of reminding actually how complex it is when it comes to looking at how we do things before we get to this current environment of verifiable credentials or wallets. In a way, the expectations of the digital economy have exceeded technology that we started building and governance standards that we started building some years ago. And I think we now actually have it upon us to actually meet some of these more complex requirements that you see reflected here when it comes to enabling governments to interact with legal entities, thinking about legal entities not just as the recipients or producers of static credentials, but actually when we think about projects or programs like the EU data spaces, if we think about what's happening around large-scale platforms, the dominance of new digital platforms in emerging and developing markets, we realize that there's so much more happening out there in the way also articulated by the previous panel, but where it stretches into lots of other domains that are actually digital first. And then legal entities are becoming their own issuers of credentials, of data, of attestations. There's a whole diverse range of things out there that now need to be a bit more standardized or digital that previously were just on paper and not very easy to integrate. Crucially, we also then need to deal with other issues around the authorized persons or the signatories. We need to actually remind ourselves that legal entities don't act on their own. Maybe we'll get to a bit of a discussion about AI agents. That's sort of future scope. But on the whole, we need to combine credentials or verification of identity of natural persons and link them to the legal entities in a way which is not too cumbersome, but which doesn't sacrifice trust, still while enabling people to verify things, not by going back to a single point of truth, but again, as was articulated in the preceding session, we do this constantly on a peer-to-peer basis without the need for intermediaries to help us do that. And we need to replicate that somehow as we move forward. And we're in a situation today, I think, which kind of looking at the macro or the super cycle of evolution of the digital economy makes this even more important. So if we go back maybe 25, maybe even 30 years now, we've been benefiting over time from a massive, massive reduction in transaction costs in the broadest sense. Digital economy has really enabled so many more activities to happen. We've seen a boost from emerging markets to developing markets, being able to conduct business with each other, not just between big, established, mature economies, but between these exotic roots of small economies on other sides of the world. But that's had secondary impact, which is that as that volume of the digital environment has grown, of course, it's invited in problems like fraud. We've seen, for example, in the last 5 to 10 years, advances, for example, in faster payment schemes, which many of the colleagues here from the World Bank know very well, have initially drastically reduced frictions as well and transaction costs, but it didn't take long for those new platforms and digital infrastructures to attract fraud, scams, and create other problems, which, along with things like data sharing schemes, have now had a follow-on effect to, first of all, scare a lot of people off of the digital economy, and secondly, have had the result that we needed to react as regulators, as policymakers, to protect the safety of the market, to reinsert foundations that give us trust, and to protect consumers. And so we've gotten to a bottleneck using blunt instruments now, which is actually in some respects the worst of both worlds. We have a low trust environment, but we have high friction still. And the solution to high frictions, like in other periods of innovation and policy, is to become more granular, more proportionate, more risk-based, but also have more bespoke tools that help us protect safety, preserve trust, and augment the size and the efficiency of the market without constricting flow. That is not the solution. And I think those are the issues we'll be talking a lot more about in many of the sessions tomorrow that we will highlight as we go forward. So with that, let me pass over to Darrell and Vasily precisely to articulate ideas about what the architecture will need to look like tomorrow if we want to change that curve behind me there in the favor of reducing transaction costs again.
Thank you very much, Ivan. One of the things I want to do is, because we're at this conference, is we need to talk about the trust triangle, just for fun. We want to talk about it in the context of the granular governance and the granular business processes that we're talking about. We all know about the whole trust triangle. We have an issuer who issues a holder something. The holder then presents it to a verifier later who can then trust that it was signed by the issuer. The business problem we have is that is what we call technical trust. I can cryptographically give you this. You can validate that I haven't tampered with it, that it was signed by the issuer. It is a valid-looking piece of a verifiable credential. What I don't know, in North America, we would use the example of a driver's license. Here, let's call it a national ID. What I don't know is was that really a country that issued a national ID? Or was it a kid who wants his friends to be able to buy things that require him to be a certain age? Or is it just a fraudulent document? We can only go so far with the tech side. What we really need is the human trust. These are the institutions that we've already got in place, the norms that we operate under, the laws that we operate under, because we know that governance is really part of the key here. That means we have various different governing authorities. There are many. The idea is let's make sure we know that that governing authority is for that one small area, not that there's one governing authority that takes care of everything. In our world, they're typically going to have a governance framework. That can take the form in government of regulation. Multiple regulations will end up, providing the backbone of a country. It could be a governance framework that says these are notaries in this particular country. What this allows us to do is establish direct trust from the governing authority to the issuers, if we're managing issuers as an example. We might want to manage verifiers. We may want to control which wallets can do what things. The key here is that at this point, the verifier knows that they can reach into this governance on a technical basis and get that human trust signal that lets them know that something is real. One of the things that Ivan mentioned was we're looking at things being very granular. One of the things we do at AYRA is we have this stackable, this composable governance approach, where we start off with a very base trust network. And on top of that, we layer a global framework. The general idea here is this. At the bottom, at the base layer, we want to make sure things are what we call thin and wide. We want to have a broad set of capabilities, this really wide set of capabilities, so that we don't typically impose much at this bottom layer, but we make room for many things. As an example, AYRA, the AYRA Trust Network, doesn't have a particular opinion right now on what assurance levels an ecosystem may use, but it makes room for them. So if you're operating in a Canadian context, where I'm from, happy Canada Day for those who celebrate, by the way. It's also AYRA's first birthday. If we're sitting in a Canadian context and I want to understand the Canadian assurance levels, Vasily is operating in a Swiss context and wants to understand, we actually may need to go to a next level, which is actually we have different assurance levels. Now I need to map them, but at least I have a concept of an assurance level. Same thing goes in a business context. What's the liability model? Liability is often a proxy for value. If someone is concerned about liability, there may be a value case underneath that. What kind of indemnity do we need? What are the commercial terms? Again, AYRA doesn't care what they are. We just make room for them so that someone who is creating a particular ecosystem can then use them, whether it's education, whether it's trade, whether it's finance. And on this broad industry basis, what we want to do is bring in those key business, governance, and technical things that we need to make sure that the sector, the industry is understood. This can be the GLEIF framework. It can be a verifiable trade framework. It can be an education, a global education framework. And then inevitably, we know we need to specialize further. Every jurisdiction has its own particular rules. They want to make sure that their sovereignty is respected. There's sub-industries. If we have very particular parts of an education industry, they may want to have their own particular rules because they do things a little bit differently. The idea there is we tailor things. We bring in the specificity at the level that we actually need, as opposed to trying to do it all at once. This allows us to build these composable, both business and governance frameworks. The technology, we're seeing it all, we saw it all morning. The technology's largely there. The technology is sufficient. It's the business and the governance part that we're working on now. I will hand off to Vasily.
Yeah, thank you, Darrell. Yeah, so maybe one more so that we can finish with the animation there. So, you know, as you've seen and you've heard from many people, you know, we need to understand the problem that we're solving and that we're modeling, right? And obviously, governance plays a very, very big role because, well, why would you trust, you know, certain signatures we heard, or was the rigor, as somebody used the term, to verify certain things that go into verifiable credential and so on and so forth, right? But we also have to sort of zoom out and take a look at the bigger picture and also what's coming towards us, right? And as we start looking at the ecosystems, we start with a very simple picture, right? So here you've seen what we call the diamond, diamond that sort of talks about the trust and everything else. So we can extend it a little bit, right? Because, you know, even with one issuer, one verifier, and one ecosystem, you know, be it European Union maybe, or just one single country such as Switzerland, we also not only have companies, right? We also have people acting on behalf of the companies, right? We've heard that companies don't operate by themselves. It's actually the employees, the representatives that do things. And in some cases, yeah, we can find those roles in registries, but most of the roles are not there, and they're changing fast, and they're very contextual. And not only we have these roles, we have, you know, machines coming. You know, we've certainly seen the flavor of what AI can do. It's still, you know, impressive, but not very useful. Becoming more useful, definitely will evolve, right? So we need to be able to trust the machines, and that's a big topic. So we sort of start extending this diamond with the roles, right? As we go forward, obviously, you know, it's not about, okay, I can prove I'm a company. How useful is that? It's actually not very useful. So you need to consider multiple companies in organizations, not just companies, but also, you know, non-for-profits and so on and so forth, you know, maybe non-formal organizations, you know, working together and driving transactions that actually bring, you know, economic value, is even, you know, alluded to, right, essentially, right? And as we create, you know, rigid forms that protect things, but maybe, you know, move the data from digital native to actually digitized paper, we're actually not solving the problem. So we need to start considering, okay, so we have multiple different credentials and multiple different roles, using these credentials, you know, to deal with each other, to automate things, to remove friction and drive value. And we go forward, as we cross the borders, this is actually how the world is today, right? We have to reduce friction to be able to drive trade, to exchange data, to you know, verify data, for training, for research, and so on and so forth. And now we have multiple ecosystems, as you can hear at the last part of it. So the ecosystem becomes very, very complex. And not only that, right, we also have to deal with the fact that the employees, the actors that represent the organization and maybe their suppliers start also being part of the system. And if we design the system correctly, they can start delegating on behalf of the organizations they represent and driving actually, you know, this chain of credentials that can be verified. And all of a sudden, we actually start reducing friction because, hey, we've set up the standards, we set up the rules, we can start creating industry-specific credentials, we can start harmonizing, but we can have very, very small, you know, in niche use cases where people just agree on some sort of terms and can act on a very local level. But you can start tracking, you know, chain of trust all the way back to those authorities, to the human trust. And all of a sudden, well, we can all innovate at the small level, at the higher level, at the, you know, at the highest level, you know, while driving assurance, while, you know, having certainty that things are what they are.
Thanks, Vasily. So that's just a kind of short taster of some of the complexities that we think we need to address if we really want to tap into the needs of the market, focusing on where actually there's repetitive undertaking of verifying data, verifying persons, verifying companies, verifying things that we have found solutions for in legacy markets to some extent. Things like accounting and audit are already examples of public goods where we have avoided deadweight loss in the economy by being able to trust other service providers to do something and take that forward. And tomorrow we wanted to highlight just a few sessions where some of these issues will be further explored. So tomorrow morning we wanted to give a shout out for our colleagues at the UN ICC. They work in a very complex environment where traditional boundaries of the domestic state, of course, don't apply solely. There are many other, there are multiple other dimensions to identity and data sharing that they have to grapple with. So call out for that session that I think everybody will find very interesting in broadening our horizons about the complexities of these things in an international world. And I'd like to highlight the session tomorrow morning, 10:50, with the World Bank Group, with IFC and World Bank, where we'll be talking a lot about how to actually use the mechanisms of verifiable identity and data and decentralized networks to really change the way MSMEs get access to finance and how we bring data used in due diligence and origination to capital markets in a way that will expand access to finance in a scalable manner in emerging markets and beyond, and how that links back to some of the things that we're doing in areas of infrastructure, such around e-invoicing and accounting. And we'll be looking at a session on investing in the smart data economy. It's crucial that we are taking sustainable approaches to develop these markets. And then lastly, another one in blue on the far-hand side, we also recognize that there's a huge underserved economy out there on the borders between informality, where companies actually are digital, but they're not able to prove who they are, and they're not able to harness the data they have. And we need to start thinking about how to cover that huge part of the market that we've so far ignored.
With AYRA and LF Decentralized Trust, we're going to be running a couple of sessions that separate a little bit from the organization concept. The first person credentials is more of a informal, how do we do things as real people? Moving all the way up, so we've got a session at 10:50 on that, which is really, but what is it and how does business be built? How does governments, how do they fit into this picture if people are doing things on a first person basis? Followed quickly by a transition into how do we use a combination of really the first person information about me if I'm a software developer in the open source, part of an organization in the open source world, how do we start to rebuild some of the trust in the open source supply chains that's necessary? And then we'll meet again, I guess, at the end of the day. Thank you very much.